I was watching this podcast the other day, the TFU podcast. You guys should check it out. His podcast is really good. He had KevOnStage the other day, and it inspired me to make some content about what I saw Kev talk about on this podcast. So I'm going to get right into it. And early on in the podcast, these are the very first two things that they talk about. So Kev goes right into it. I took some notes because I didn't want to present things in the wrong way. Kev was kind of releasing his book. His book is called Successful Failure. It's not his first book. His first book was a New York Times bestseller, and Target was a huge reason for that, okay? Target is like a huge retailer for physical books, okay? Also, black people are big buyers at Target, and if you guys are familiar with KevOnStage, black people are his main demographic. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, okay? So couple those two things to where Target, huge retailer for physical books. Black people, big buyers at Target. You need both of those things to sell a book if you're KevOnStage. Especially when you think about, he actually brought up this point where physical books only account for New York Times bestsellers. Audiobooks don't really count towards your data when it comes to showing up on the New York Times bestseller. Now, put that in perspective because his first book was obviously a New York Times bestseller. It did very good, and a lot of that was because of Target. Okay, his first book was heavily being pushed at Target. He did lots of in-stores and promotion, which found success with that previous book, obviously. Like I said, it became a New York Times bestseller. So now it's time for him to release his new book. So he goes to his publisher, who at the time, now this Target boycott is going on, okay? And he goes to his publisher, who's not even aware of the boycott, and of course wants to maximize this release, similar to their previous strategy. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? They sold a lot of books at Target. So the publisher is naturally like, let's do exactly what we did. Push Target heavily. I got this set up. Man, we're going to sell a bunch of books at Target like we did, even more than last time. You're going to do more in stores at Target. We're going to promote the shit out of this book at Target, okay? So then comes the point where Kev's like, well, it's going to be different this time around because right now black people are engaged in a boycott with Target, and I don't want to participate in the additional Target promotion, okay? He doesn't want to do any in-store stuff with Target due to the boycott. He personally, he can't necessarily control whether Target carries the book or not, but he could control whether he actively promoted the book through Target. So at this point, his publisher is like, what the fuck? Are you crazy? And the publisher actually compares it to, imagine you have a product and you decide not to sell that on Amazon. That's crazy, right? The publisher is like, Kev, I hear you, but take some time to think about this, okay? Because this is crazy. Especially because your last book was already a New York Times bestseller. What are you thinking, man? I hear you, but this is nuts. And Kev literally comes to the point where he talks to the publisher and he's like, I know it's going to cost me money, and even if it keeps me off the New York Times bestseller, I can live with that, okay? He literally says, I can live with that, and I quote, more than being on the wrong side of what my community is doing. And so the publisher is flabbergasted. You have to. It all ends well. He makes the decision not to promote it at Target. And, he still ends up on the New York Times bestseller list, which he attributes to God, morals, and his people. I repeat, morals. Okay. Now, he goes into another story right after. Early in the Kaepernick boycott, way before the Kaepernick settlement, the NFL reaches out directly with a brand deal with substantial numbers on a check. He says it's obviously in seven figures at least. He talks about this, right? So, in Kevin's mind, he's not rocking with the NFL. Like I said, this is early in the Kaepernick boycott. In his mind, he's like, the NFL needs to right their wrongs with Kaepernick or I ain't supporting, okay? And let's add perspective. This is not the KevOnStage that is now. KevOnStage now is on top of the world, obviously. But this is earlier on in his career where a big check would have substantially improved his quality of living. He makes reference to literally living in the same house that they got robbed in, and this house is currently infested with bees. Listen to the podcast, okay? So, this is similar to the book situation. He goes to his agent is astounded, similar to his publisher. Now, this isn't like Target where the boycott is like, it's a huge big ass boycott to where it's like huge solidarity. But at the time, a bunch of black people was not fucking with the NFL during that time. So this is where another time where his morals came into question, especially the timing more than anything. Timing. Okay. So he wasn't cool with it personally. Okay. So he ended up refusing that decision, and he attributed that to his morals. Okay, so think about those two things. Target, then the NFL. He turns down both, okay, during, boycotts. All right. And the more I thought about those two stories, the more I realized there was something much bigger here that I wanted to talk about. The price of solidarity. Okay. What fascinated me about these stories wasn't simply that KevOnStage turned down money. People turn down business opportunities every day. What fascinated me was when he turned the money down. In both situations, there was some form of collective black resistance happening around the institution offering him the opportunity. And I think that changes the moral question, because now the question isn't simply, is this a good business opportunity? The question becomes, what does solidarity require from you when solidarity actually costs you something? Because I think we sometimes measure solidarity by what people say. Who made the statement? Who posted the hashtag? Who said they stood with the community? But maybe a better measurement of solidarity is what you're willing to surrender. Because solidarity is easy when your individual interests and the interests of the group are moving in the same direction. The moral dilemma begins when they separate. What happens when standing with everybody else means losing money, losing distribution, losing exposure, losing access, losing an opportunity that might not come again? That's when solidarity stops being a statement and becomes a sacrifice. And that's what makes these KevOnStage stories so interesting to me. Because if these opportunities didn't matter to Kev, turning them down wouldn't tell us very much. If Target couldn't help his book, who cares if he declined the additional promotion? If the NFL opportunity couldn't materially affect his life or his businesses, who cares if he turned it down? The opportunity having value is precisely what gives the refusal moral weight. And while I was thinking about that, there was one person I couldn't stop thinking about: Jay-Z. Let's discuss the Jay-Z connection. Because strangely enough, two of the institutions KevOnStage says he was willing to distance himself from during moments of black collective action are institutions Jay-Z chose to deepen his business relationships with: Target and the NFL. Now, before somebody tries to reduce this entire conversation to KevOnStage good, Jay-Z bad, that ain't what I'm trying to do. And I'm also not claiming these business situations were identical. They weren't. Kev was releasing a book. Jay was releasing an album. The deals were different. Their positions within the entertainment industry were different. The circumstances surrounding each controversy were different. But the moral tension underneath the decisions is comparable. In each situation, there's conflict between portions of the black community and a major corporation. There's a valuable business opportunity involving that corporation, and the individual has to decide what participation means during that particular moment. And that's where the contrast between Kev and Jay becomes interesting to me. Because Kev's response, according to the stories he told, was essentially, not right now. Not necessarily never. Not this corporation is permanently dead to me. But while this is happening, I'm not comfortable participating in this opportunity. And that's an extremely important distinction, because my problem isn't necessarily with corporate participation. My problem is timing. The issue is timing. I want to make this extremely clear because I don't want my argument confused with something I'm not saying. I'm not against corporate partnerships. I'm not saying Jay-Z should never work with Target. I'm not saying Jay-Z should never work with the NFL. I'm not even against the argument that having access to powerful institutions can potentially give somebody an opportunity to influence those institutions. That's a legitimate conversation. My issue is timing. Because if the boycott is over and you believe getting inside that institution gives you leverage, that's a completely different discussion. We can debate access. We can debate influence. We can debate whether having a seat at the table actually produces change. We can debate whether somebody like Jay-Z can accomplish more by working with an institution than protesting outside of it. I'm completely open to that conversation. But during the boycott, that's different. Because during the boycott, the withdrawal of participation is the strategy. That's literally where the leverage comes from. So my question isn't, did you do business with this corporation? My question is, what did your participation mean while everybody else was deliberately withholding theirs? Because participation during normal circumstances and participation during organized collective action aren't necessarily morally equivalent. The context changed. And therefore, in my opinion, the moral calculation changes with it. Because here's the thing about boycotts. Everybody has a reason to cross the line. The employee needs the paycheck. The customer wants the product. The entrepreneur needs the distribution. The entertainer wants the partnership. The investor wants the return. Everybody can produce an individual reason why participating makes sense for them. And individually, some of those explanations might be completely reasonable. But collective action only becomes powerful when people temporarily decide that the collective objective matters more than their individual reason. That's the sacrifice. Because if everybody gets to exempt themselves from collective sacrifice because their particular opportunity is especially valuable, then there is no collective action. Think about it. The entire purpose of a boycott is to take thousands or millions of relatively insignificant individual decisions and combine them into something economically significant. One person not shopping somewhere probably doesn't matter. One person refusing a partnership probably doesn't matter. One person withholding their money probably doesn't matter. But collectively, now you've created leverage. And that leverage only exists because everybody agrees temporarily there's something I could gain individually by participating, but right now I'm willing to give that up because we're trying to accomplish something collectively. Which is why I don't think the argument about institutional access completely answers the question I'm asking. Maybe access is valuable. Maybe working with these corporations eventually produces something beneficial. Maybe having Jay-Z inside the room ultimately creates opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. Fine. But why does that access have to be pursued during the exact moment when collective leverage depends upon withholding that participation? If the opportunities still make sense after the boycott, pursue it afterward. If you want the seat at the table, take the seat afterward. If you believe working from inside is more productive than protesting from outside, make that argument afterward. But during collective action, participation isn't neutral, because non-participation is the mechanism creating the pressure. And that's what brings me back to KevOnStage. There's another part of Kev's stories that makes what he did particularly impressive to me. And that's the proportional cost of saying no. I'm not interested in comparing people's bank accounts. I'm not pretending I know exactly what Kev had or what Jay had at every particular moment. And I don't need exact net worth numbers to make this point, because I'm not talking strictly about dollars. I'm talking about what the opportunity represents to the person being asked to walk away from it. That's how I think sacrifice has to be measured. Because somebody turning down $1 million when they have very little isn't necessarily making a smaller sacrifice than somebody turning down $10 million when they're already extraordinarily wealthy. The number might be smaller. The proportional sacrifice can be much larger. And that's what stands out to me about Kev, especially with the NFL situation. Kev himself talks about being in a completely different financial position at that point in his career. So we're talking about an opportunity that potentially could have materially changed his business and financial situation, and he turned it down. And Kev isn't making these decisions in some vacuum where only he experiences the consequences. He's building a company. He's employing people. He's financing productions. He's trying to grow something. Other people's opportunities are connected to the success of his business too. So there were legitimate economic incentives telling him, take the deal. And according to the stories he's telling, he said no anyway. And that's the paradox that really sticks with me. The person with less institutional power appears to have been more willing to sacrifice institutional opportunity. And I'm not saying that to bash Jay-Z. I'm saying it because that's precisely what makes Kev's decision worthy of highlighting. Okay, let's really discuss what Kev's refusal demonstrates. Because ultimately, that's what I admire about KevOnStage in these stories. Not that he rejected corporations, not that he rejected money, not that I believe black people should permanently refuse to work with Target or the NFL, and not even that everybody necessarily has to make exactly the same decision Kev made. What I respect is that he apparently identified a point where his principles placed a limit on what opportunities he was willing to accept. That's important to me, because principles aren't really tested when following them is convenient. They're tested when following them interferes with something you want. The opportunity being valuable doesn't weaken the moral significance of Kev's decision. The opportunity being valuable is what gives the decision its moral significance. If Target couldn't help sell his book, refusing Target wouldn't mean much. If the NFL opportunity couldn't materially change his position, refusing the NFL wouldn't tell us nearly as much. The temptation is what creates the test. And that's why these stories stuck with me. Kev wasn't describing morality as some abstract concept. He was describing morality with an opportunity cost attached to it. And when that opportunity cost showed up, apparently there was a line he wasn't willing to cross. And maybe that's ultimately what solidarity requires. There has to be a price you're willing to pay. Otherwise, what exactly are we measuring? If I support you until supporting you costs me money, if I support you until supporting you costs me access, if I support you until supporting you threatens my distribution, if I support you until supporting you jeopardizes an opportunity I've spent my entire career trying to reach, then maybe my principles aren't determining my business decisions. Maybe my business decisions are determining the limits of my principles. And that's ultimately why those KevOnStage stories stood out to me. Because he wasn't talking about morality after the opportunity disappeared. He wasn't talking about what he would have done in some hypothetical situation. According to him, the opportunity was sitting right there. The money was real. The potential benefit was real. And so was the cost of saying no. And he said no anyway. That's the part I admire, because sacrifice isn't measured by what you're willing to turn down when you don't need it. Sacrifice is measured by what you're willing to turn down when saying yes would materially benefit you. And that's why for me, this conversation isn't ultimately about whether Target is good or bad. It's not about whether the NFL is good or bad. And honestly, it's not even really about Jay-Z. It's about timing. It's about what solidarity means during that very small window when everybody's individual interests are being asked to take a backseat to something collective. Because after the boycott, we can talk about access. After the protests, we can talk about partnerships. After the collective action, we can debate seats at the table and working from the inside. Those are legitimate conversations. But during the collective action, the sacrifice is the point. And that's what KevOnStage's stories demonstrated to me. He had something to gain. He had legitimate reasons to say yes. And apparently he decided there was something more important in that particular moment than what he personally stood to gain. So maybe that's the question worth asking whenever we talk about solidarity during collective struggle. When the community collectively decides that its power comes from saying no, what responsibility do the people with the greatest opportunity to say yes have to stand with them? Can't lie, at the time it never bothered me. At the bar, getting my thug on properly. My squad and me lack of respect for authority. Laughing hard, happy to be escaping poverty, however brief. The Jay speaking here believes he's the future self. He believes he's reached the point where he can look back and understand what happened. But from the perspective of the larger story, he hasn't reached the end yet. This is another future self coming, a darker one. It's almost like past Jay to reflective Jay and Can I Live, and then consume Jay and the Evils. And the middle version doesn't realize he's still changing. In Can I Live, the hustle is still something Jay does. In the Evils, the hustle increasingly becomes who Jay is. And once an identity fully emerges with a system, reflection becomes difficult because reflection requires distance. And so this reflective voice almost feels fragile, like we're catching one of the last moments where Jay can step outside the machine and evaluate. And that ties perfectly into the title, Can I Live? Because in this moment, living and reflecting are almost competing with each other. He's so busy living the life that he hasn't yet fully examined the price of it.
If you enjoy my way of thinking, I invite you to start this hidden bar journey from the beginning. We started with Jay-Z and Rick Ross Freemasonry, then we traveled down with the Clips to why they deserve a Grammy with whips and chains. Next came Cameron in episode 3 with Get 'em Girls. Then we went to Kodak Black, Testimony. Episode 5, Jay Z D Evils. Episode 6 is currently being released in chapters, which is my song, Black Jesus. The first two chapters are out now. We're also releasing Can I Live in chapters. Can I Live is actually a prequel to D Evils. So I invite you, you don't have to, but I invite you to check out Jay Z's D Evils first because we're going to be making a lot of callbacks to that episode in this series. So check it out, Hidden Bar, where lyrics become literature.